All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Talking with Teal podcast. I'm Ryan Nakade, and today I'm very happy to be joined here with a very special friend of mine, Charles Marxer. So, Charles, thank you so much for coming on today.
Hey, Ryan, it's a pleasure. Good to see you.
Great to see you. And a little background, Charles and I met initially on the Integral Life website, and I had the great pleasure of meeting him last year when he visited Portland. So I'm thrilled to be here with you again online. And I know there are some very juicy topics you wanted to discuss today. But before we jump into those, I thought it would be nice for you to quickly give us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in integral theory.
Sure. Let's see. Well, to start the story, it takes me back to the 1970s when I fell in love with Buddhism. Started to read in Buddhist texts quite a lot, and Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki and all those early proselytizers of Buddhism to the West. And then I heard about the Zen Center of Vancouver. They had a house in downtown Vancouver, which is about 20 miles away from me. And I found out they had some rooms for rent. And so I joined that community and practiced Zen daily with them for about a year. And they were under the tutelage of Joshu Sasaki Roshi of the Rinzai line, who had a headquarters monastery down in Southern California. So I did a couple of retreats with him. And then I heard about a North American master on Maui, which is the state where you're from, right? Hawaii?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I spent the better part of 3 years there. Did 3 training periods of 3 months long. And I had a Kensho experience. Studied, the master there is a great guy. He's the first North American master ever ordained in this particular line, the Harada Yasutani line. So that's where I cut my teeth on real Buddhist training. And then it would have been probably skipping forward to the 90s. I had remarried, had a couple of kids to look after. So I kind of lost touch with Zen practice during those years. But in the early to mid 90s, I happened to be in a bookstore thumbing through a journal called Tricycle. And I don't know if it still exists, but it's a Buddhist, was at the time a Buddhist publication. And in this issue, it had an interview with Ken Wilber. I'd never heard of him before. And after I read the article, I was hooked. I said, I got to know about this guy. And so I started to investigate. I forget the first of Ken's books that I read. I rather think that it might have been Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, The Evolution of Spirit. Nothing like starting with his biggest book.
That's right. Jumping into the deep end of the pool there.
I guess. So I read that. It probably took me a month or two to read it. It's an 800-page book. And it's just rich with philosophical insights, knowledge of history, history of science, and all those disciplines that Wilbur has mastered. And it might have been the first book where his entire system was on display. So that was the beginning, and now I've read most of his books and have been an avid follower of Ken's ever since. So I guess about 20 years now.
Wow, wonderful. And I'm also curious because I know you have a very robust Western philosophy background as well, on top of the Buddhist practice that you've done. And can you tell us a little bit about how your study of Western philosophy informed your interest in integral theory?
Well, it probably has to do with my my initial interest in philosophy when I was in college. The small liberal arts college I went to in Kansas City, Missouri, required all the students to take a philosophy course, and it really opened my eyes to the beauty of philosophical thinking and the pleasures of thinking philosophically. And when I took a logic course, I was introduced to the strategies, techniques, and the art of careful thinking, which had never been taught to me before. And I thought it was so cool that I just decided I was going to major in it. So I took courses in the history of philosophy and metaphysics, and epistemology. But the philosophy taught at the college I was attending was kind of obsolete. They were taught from old Catholic texts, and the philosophy was always taught in the interest of Catholic theology, especially St. Thomas Aquinas.
Mm.
I still liked it, but I didn't know much about the larger world of philosophy until I went to graduate school in the University of Toronto. And then I took courses in existentialism and modern logic and early modern philosophy, some more history of philosophy, and really got a much broader education in Western philosophy. And then, of course, started reading a lot on my own. And then in 1967, I guess, maybe 66, I had my first teaching assignment. And that launched me on a multi-year teaching career, which I finished up here in British Columbia back in 2005. So yeah, a lot of Western philosophy before I discovered Buddhism. And yeah, I think my Zen practice in Hawaii changed my approach to some of my teaching and gave new energy to it.
Yes, absolutely. And so did you integrate the teachings of Ken Wilber and integral theory into your university teaching?
No, because at the time that I discovered Ken, I was no longer in the university system.
Mm.
When I came back from Maui, it was harder and harder to find full-time work. Now, I taught for several years on a contract basis, a couple of courses per semester. Then I got a full year assignment, but that was only temporary. So after a while, I needed to make more money. So I got a teacher's certificate and started teaching in the primary schools here in British Columbia. I guess what you call elementary schools, mostly grades 4, 5, and 6.
Mm.
So I did that until 2005 while reading philosophy. And it was while doing that teaching that I discovered Ken and started reading in his works. So I had no opportunity to teach integral philosophy while I was teaching at the college here in British Columbia.
I see.
But after I retired, I became moderator of the philosophers group here in White Rock, and I started to teach integral philosophy informally. I gave seminars on it, and I organized a small book club, and we studied Ken's A Theory of Everything. No, sorry, it wasn't that. It was A Brief History of Everything.
Mm.
Nice little study group. We had a great time. We went through A Brief History of Everything page by page. It was really good.
Excellent. And that's a great segue to some of the topics that you wanted to discuss today. And I know that you would briefly inform me about the recent imbroglio that has occurred with some of the theology groups in Canada. Can you give us the whole story on that?
Yes, very briefly. For the last 10 years, one of the ministers in the United Church in Toronto has been publicly jabbing at the theological elite of the church to abandon what she thought is their obsolete mainline theology, which is put forth in a series of what are called statements of faith. There are at least 4 of them, and the earliest one was in 1925. So a little background here, the United Church is called United because it's the amalgam or union of 3 separate Protestant denominations at the time. I guess in the early 20s, they started talking about it. Then 1925, I guess, they sealed the union. And these were the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists. So they adopted a common theology, which was conservative, but not fundamentalistic. But Christians all over the world would recognize it as, pretty much a core theology of of the Protestant mainstream. So it's a large denomination in Canada. It might be the largest, and over the years it has become more liberal, and it has published several additional statements of faith. One in 1940, another one in 1966. and then one recently just a few years ago. And each time it's become a little more liberal. And so the United Church has a reputation for being very liberal about issues like liberation theology, ordination of women, women's equality, ordaining gay ministers, promoting the rights of the LGBTQ community, and a lot of kinds of social work. So it has this very liberal reputation. So maybe it was predictable that something like this was going to happen. This minister named Greta Bhaskar started to publish books and papers, sort of very, what shall I say, stridently arguing that the church should revamp its theology and give up all the supernaturalistic elements. So no more Old Testament God of the Israelites, God the Father, no more literal interpretation of the scriptures. God didn't really rain frogs down on top of the Egyptians, and Jesus didn't really turn a few loaves and fishes into a mass of food that filled 5,000. He didn't really rise from the dead. These sorts of supernaturalistic elements, Greta Bhaskar wanted to be dropped altogether. Pretty radical request. So this came to a head a few months ago because a lot of church members were getting upset about this. They were hearing from members all over the country, and clergy were confused. Some of them agreed with Bhaskar, and some of them did not. So the church had to do something, and they have a council system that deals with issues of doctrine. So they said, well, we better summon this conference and talk about this. And they thought at first they should probably get rid of this minister. She's a heretic. Centuries ago, they would have burned her at the stake. So that was the issue. And about this time, they got a new chancellor. The old chancellor had been very conservative, and Bhaskar's battle was mostly with him. Well, there was a new chancellor, and he's in integral terms, I think he's green. He's not amber anymore. He's green. He espouses a theology called panentheism, which we could talk about a little later. So anyway, he conferred with the conference, and they had interviews with Greta Bhaskar, who had hired some lawyers, by the way, and they finally decided they weren't going to hold this ecclesiastical court. The ecclesiastical court would have decided whether she was a heretic or not, and whether to remove her from her ministry. But apparently the moderator and the other people on this council said, you know what, that would be politically very bad and probably not a good idea. So they made their peace with Reverend Bhaskar, sent her back to her congregation, which was very glad to get her back. And she has been able to resume her duties with all her privileges and prerogatives and her salary and everything else. So it looks like peace has been restored, but I think, and my friends think too, that it's kind of an uneasy truce. So my friends who call themselves progressive theologians, progressive Christians, if you will, one of them is a former pastor. He's a good friend of mine. The other is a pastor also, and they have friends. And there are people all across the country, clergy in the United Church, who agree with Greta Bhaskar and are not supernaturalists anymore. It may be a relatively small percentage. Most of the members are, mainstream center conservative. But there's still a lot of people confused and upset, and pastors not knowing how to preach to and counsel their members, their congregations. So there's still a fermenting issue here. So my friend Wes Book, who knows integral philosophy himself, asked me if I would address this group. So there was a group of about 20, and we met a few weeks ago. And they were very, very well engaged, I must say. They were great listeners, had great questions. And I was able to give them a power presentation on just the stages of development and lines of development to try to explain how this renegade minister Vosper was related to the mainstream theology of the church, which is Amber, right? It's at the Amber level. And she's at Orange Modern. And there are undoubtedly members who are at the green level. So I tried to explain the basic spectrum of stage structures in the development of consciousness. I think that went over pretty well. And then I explained the various lines of development. And then I pulled out the spiritual line of development, which is the most relevant one here, right? And then I explored that with them. And I mentioned some prominent names of Christians who are at various levels in the spiritual line of development. For example, at Amber Traditional, I mentioned Pope Francis. At the Red Warrior stage, I mentioned Donald Trump. Couldn't think of anybody else. I mean, you know, Pope Julius II is not around anymore. He was a warrior pope. So I don't know how many of these guys are around. But Amber, Green, and Integral, Amber, Orange, and Green, there are lots of those folks around. For example, at Green, there's a theologian named Paul Knitter, whom I suppose many people don't know, but among Christian theologians, he's a pretty famous guy. So he's an example of a postmodern pluralist Christian theologian. And finally, at the top, at Integral, are guys like Thomas Keating, a Catholic monk who is now dead, good friend of Ken Wilber's, and another one, David Steindl Rast, who's also a Catholic monk. He's Integral. And Paul R. Smith is from the Southern Baptist congregation, has written a book called Integral Christianity. He has swallowed the whole fish and worked out an integral theology with his congregation over a period of about 40 years. So he looks to me like the go-to guy for what I'm going to suggest to this group, to the United Church, that they need to become an integral church. Otherwise, I don't see how they're going to have a harmonious relationship between all these groups of people who are at different levels of development. So there's going to be another meeting fairly soon, and I'll be making a more far-ranging presentation there. I'll present the whole integral theory to them, and maybe some suggestions, and there'll be a lot of question-answer kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of on the cutting edge of theology out here, which is a bit of a surprise. Didn't expect this to come up, but it's fun. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, that's great. I love how you had an example of a figure that everyone knows as a embodiment or example of each stage. People can immediately kind of relate to that and have a sense of what each stage means, especially as it manifests through particular individuals. So I have a few questions about that. The first one is, can you tell us a little bit more about how the audience, who presumably, I think most of them had no idea about what integral theory was, and all of these colors and stages and new information, what did they make of all of that? Were there any objections to that model?
Not really. Well, I had made the comment during my talk that people in this day and age don't really believe in the tyrant God of the Old Testament. And one lady came up to me and said, "Oh, he wasn't a tyrant. He did some good things." And I said, "Well, yes, okay. He did some good things, but he did some bad things." So that was the only sort of challenge I got. But there were actually a couple of people in the group who have heard of Ken Wilber before and have read some of his stuff. And we recommended, my friends and I had sent them links to some documents that the group could read to prepare themselves for this first meeting. So they may have read Ken's Introduction to the Integral Approach, which is a PDF document that's free on the Integral website. It's probably the shortest introduction to Integral that I know of. It's kind of a condensation of the Integral vision, you know, the little blue paperback. Mm-hmm. It was really good. So we sent that out to everybody and also recommended a couple other books, including the Integral Vision, that are fairly easy to read. So by the time this second meeting is set up, I think people will have read a fair amount of material, which is pretty important, because you know, in the course of an hour's lecture, it's pretty hard to remember much and formulate the kind of questions that would really take them deeper. Nevertheless, the group was really engaged, great listeners. We had a time for a few questions afterwards. They were very intelligent, and I would say the audience in general, almost entirely, was quite receptive to what I was saying.
And just out of curiosity, what would you say the audience that you presented to was their overall center of gravity? Were they mostly orange and green, or some amber, or what do you think the spread was?
Well, I didn't get a chance to talk to them much, but my guess is that they're moving out of amber, or they're maybe into green, leaning toward Integral already. Oh, hang on, I skipped orange. Probably a lot of them are at orange in their philosophical or cognitive development, and are therefore the kind of folks who are not very comfortable anymore with traditional theology. I would be pretty sure about that. So, which means they're ripe, yes, for growing up to higher levels, especially if they're green.
Right. And how do you think that this integral model that you presented will help them to sort through the divisive debate around the core issue of this minister wanting to do away with all of the traditional mythic literal interpretations of scripture? How do you think that this model will help them to adjudicate that conflict?
All right. The details of the meeting between Greta Bhaskar and the ecclesiastical court have not been made public. So we don't know exactly what the settlement was. All we know is the public pronouncements of the moderator, the new head, the CEO basically of the church, and he said everything is fine. Greta Bhaskar is going back to her ministry, but he indicated that the conversation will continue because there's a certain tension between the early Orthodox statements of faith and the newer, more liberal, more modern persuasions, and now this radical point of view from ministers like Greta Bhaskar, and she's not the only one. So he indicated that although the two sides for now have made peace with one another, that the issue will continue to be alive, that he's going to be dealing with it, and that he wants everybody to be included in the discussion, and he's hopeful that when it all ends, everybody who has kind of a different take on the church in the 21st century will be able to relate to one another without, trying to get people kicked out and other people sent to hell and so forth.
Yeah.
So my hunch is that that there's still going to be a lot of conversation about this, but I don't know how much of it will actually appeal to rank and file members. The people who go to church every Sunday and are raising families, go to work every day, and so on. They may not care all that much, as long as they're hearing what they need to hear from their pastor. So what my friends are mainly concerned about, my friend Wes, who's the main guy I'm working with here, he's a psychologist who's worried about clergy in the church, and he knows there are quite a few of them who no longer believe in the supernaturalistic theology of the traditional church, but they still have to preach that theology from the pulpits on Sunday. well, you can imagine the cognitive dissonance they're suffering from.
Yes.
And that's not good. The pastors should be able to be honest with their congregations as to what their real views are. They just haven't been able to figure out a way to do it. So my view is that if the church can grasp and take hold of the idea of an integral Christianity, then it can take the lead in teaching its 300,000 members across the nation how to understand these various different views and how to include them in an integral view of Christianity.
Yes, and in your view, how do you exactly see an integral Christianity embracing and articulating the views of mostly amber and traditional mythical views? Should they be articulated in and understood symbolically or allegorically, or would that do too much of a disservice to the members who are at an amber center of gravity? How do you think they should really express these amber stories?
Great question. Now, when the revolt against the traditional church began about 500 years ago, the philosophers took the orange rational point of view that the stories in the Old Testament and the New Testament should be read as myths, as allegories, as moral lessons. And that, of course, caused a huge uproar. That was a clash of worldviews. And that continued for several hundred years, more or less unabated. And until now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have the so-called new atheists like Sam Harris and
Dawkins and Dennett and
Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens. So that's all a battle between the amber mythic and the orange modern. Mm-hmm. Those two will never get along with each other. So your question, how does Christianity become integral and kind of soften those culture wars? Well, the way Ken puts it in his book, The Religion of Tomorrow, is absolutely brilliant idea. And here's how it goes. The religion of the 21st and later centuries will be like a conveyor belt of, how shall I put it, helping individuals to manage their growth from archaic to magic mythic to amber and so on. In this general way, I don't think anybody has the details worked out too much, but in this religion of the future, the intellectual elite will all be at integral. They might be hard, but they'll all be at integral. And they will have written a program of teaching for their clergy that ministers to the needs of young people in their congregations across the country in such a way that, let's say, at 4 or 5 years of age, the child starts to get interested in, the big questions. Or maybe starting with a little question, learns about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. And parents who are raised at integral will not tell the child, in fact, no parent actually should do this. They won't tell the child, oh, there's really no Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus doesn't exist. And that's kind of cruel, because the child needs to believe in things like that, right? Because that's where they are developmentally, right? They're at Magenta and maybe early red. They need to think about the world in terms of story. Little kids are always making stories about what's going on to make sense out of their world. So an integral parent these days would buy right into the Santa Claus story. Say, yeah, let's read about Santa Claus. Let's talk about him. I mean, lots of parents do so anyway, right? But they will simply wait until the child says one day, "Hey, I heard that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Is that true?" And then the parents will say, "Well, he doesn't really live at the North Pole, but it's a great story, isn't it? And Santa Claus still lives in your heart and in the spirit of Christmas," something like that, right? So here the kid has already outgrown Santa Claus and moves up to a different stage of growth, probably amber, by the age of 6 or 7. And so now he's aware of religions practiced by people at his school, his friends, and so on. And so he knows about beliefs about God, about the afterlife, about moral teachings, and so on. He's going to start asking his parents. And at school, he's going to start to get teachings about this. Well, the church will have a whole set of teachings in place for kids at this level. And the kids are at mythic level now. And they're saying, well, Santa Claus doesn't exist, and the Tooth Fairy and Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings can't really do things with his magic wand, right? But their imagination is caught by this story of an all-powerful God whom you can't see. So they can now project their need for order and power onto this being. And so they're ready for a mythic story about reality. And they might start getting Bible stories. If they're in a Christian community, they'll start hearing Bible stories. And their parents will read them Bible stories, even though the parents don't believe them literally. But the kid will, and he'll ask questions about God, and the parents will answer them. Okay? So the basic idea is that the teachings will be geared to children at the developmental stage that they are, stage appropriate teachings, and allow the kids to believe them 100% and even practice, right, to go to church with those ideas and so on. And then as the children grow older through the various stages, there's a new set of teachings that transcend and include the earlier ones at the earlier stage. So at Orange Rational, when the child is in early adolescence, starts to learn about how the myths should not be interpreted literally anymore, and the church is there to help them with this transition. And so on, right on up to however far the individuals can actually grow, which the church can guarantee. So do you get the point here? And the metaphor that Ken uses is that the churches, plural, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, they'll become like conveyor belts to take the children through one stage to another, and to another, without forcing the individual to leave the church or find a church that teaches something different, or even get out of the church altogether, because there will be a place for them within the church, no matter what stage they're at. Now, if you want to see an example of actually how this would work out in detail, the best source is Paul R. Smith's book, Integral Christianity, where he's worked out the whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an excellent book, and I recommended it to these folks out here. So does that kind of help with your question?
Yes, excellent answer. Unfortunately, we only have about 5 minutes left here before we have to wrap it up, but we'll definitely have to do this again sometime. So
Sure.
Just to wind it down, can you tell us a little bit about what's the next step? What's the next step for your presentation, and how do you see yourself being able to help the theology group bring this all together and apply it?
Good. Well, I'm hoping they will have done some reading. And if so, they'll be ready to kind of take on the whole integral structure. Because in the first meeting, I singled out stages and lines of development. because those were the two elements of integral that were most relevant to the Greta Bhaskar versus the United Church issue. So I didn't talk very much about, in fact, I didn't talk at all about states of consciousness and types. And I didn't talk about any stages above green, really. So I didn't say much about integral, and I didn't talk about spiritual states as such, nor about spiritual stages that actually appear on the spiritual line of development above integral. Ken talks about super integral, right? Which I think is still, might be high second tier, or it might be low third tier. But the third tier draws upon the Eastern traditions of state stages. So the first being gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. Those are the four that that Wilber focuses on in his works, especially in his later works. There are many more that could be identified, you know, drawing upon Buddhist and Hindu texts and maybe some others. But basically, all the traditions seem to agree on these four. So above orange rational, you've got green, you've got teal turquoise. That's second tier, right? Mm-hmm. And then third tier would be the spiritual stages of stages of gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. So I didn't talk about any of those. And I didn't talk about states of consciousness either. Or types, which is the fifth element. But Ken has really stressed a sixth element. You could say really there are six basic elements in integral theory. And the sixth is shadow work. He's putting a lot of emphasis into that these days, as do some of the others. So in the second meeting with this group, I'm going to go back and explain all of those. And explain this is the whole integral package. And for any church, which after all is interested in the transformation of the souls of their people, they don't want to leave any of these elements out. They want to include them all in an upgraded operating system, or as they would put it, an upgraded theology for their congregations. So I'm hoping that'll have some resonance, but that's what I'm going to do.
Great. Yeah, wonderful, Charles. And so just to end, can you tell us a little bit about where people can find some of your writings or blog or website? Can you just name the website?
Sure. Actually, good idea. I just answered a fellow on the integral community. Yesterday, I spotted his message, and I think he sent it to you. And it was about troubles he was having with a group of friends he was talking with. Right. That they were very narrow-minded about what religion is. So I posted a reply to him, and I mentioned that he might like my recent essays on the nature, on how to define religion. That's on my website, which is called whiterockphilosophers.blogspot.com. I think you have that URL, do you not?
Yes, I do, and I'll post it when I.
Yeah, you can send it to wherever you wish, and if people are interested in that topic, I think they'll like those essays.
Yes, well, I'm so sorry that we have to get going a little early here because of the technical difficulties that set us back. But
yeah, they did.
Thank you so much for your time, Charles, and it's really wonderful to hear you doing all of this wonderful work and applying the integral model out in the world for a very important cause. And best of luck to you on your second presentation. We'll have to do another one of these for you to give us a follow-up. So thank you.
All right. Excellent. This has been terrific, Ryan. I always enjoy my conversations with you. Good to see you again.
Yes.
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Take care.
All right.